Theme parks are stuck. Some rides legally cannot be removed, rebuilt, or even modernised. But is that saving history, or is that holding back progress? Right, let's set the scene, shall we? Because every park has the same problem. Whether they are small or large, they all have a finite amount of space. What that means is, when it's time for a new attraction, many times they have to consider removing something or multiple rides to put that new attraction in. The problem is, no matter what that ride is, it is going to be somebody's favourite. Everybody has different preferences and different connections to an attraction. It could be the very first ride you went on. It could be a ride you went on with your father or your grandfather who's no longer with us. It could be the first ride you took your own child on, or just something that has a special meaning to you. So when the ride is removed, there is always going to be a group of people who are upset. Now, Blackpool Pleasure Beach, my own local park, they basically said that they have got to where they are based on heritage and nostalgia, but that isn't going to get them into the future. So they're having to make some tough decisions. And let's be fair, current generation, they're not interested in a ride that is 100 years old. Yes, there are some of us that are a little older that may remember it from our youth or just appreciate those older rides. But more and more, the younger generation, they just want the new flashy thing. So a complication that comes along with this is that there are scenarios where some attractions are marked as listed. Now, if you don't know what listed means, it basically means that it is a protected attraction and that the park is then limited in what they can do to that ride. They have to preserve it as close to the original as is possible. And that is quite a difficult task, right? Because there's various things as we'll cover later on, around kind of safety standards, modernisation, etc., that may or may not be possible. There's some challenges around funding as well that we'll cover later on. But it's one of those things that it makes some sense when you're talking about a building, right? Take, for example, the old house, the kind of mansion inside Alton Towers, right? That, you wouldn't expect to rock up there next season and find they turned it into an arcade, right? That would just be wrong. So there are a number of times where protecting these kind of buildings and assets does make some sense. I've got a comment here. I put a post up specifically around this topic, mainly around the Big Dipper, just so a lot of the context here will be around that ride specifically, but the points apply to all the rides that are affected by this. I got a comment here that from Michael that says, buildings becoming listed, and then because of this they find it hard to get someone to take over and repurpose them. They stand empty, fall into disrepair, and end up mysteriously catching fire one night. Now, obviously nobody wants that from an attraction. You don't want the attraction to get to the stage where it is SBNO, right? Standing but not operating. That is the worst thing. There is nothing worse than going into a park and seeing all these attractions, but they're closed. It's far better to remove them or keep them going, obviously, if it's possible, but you don't want to get to that stage. Right, so I've gone through all of the comments that you guys put on that post a few weeks back, and you seem to fall into three camps. Around about 40% of you think these rides should be preserved. A similar percentage think these rides should be removed, and around 20% of you think that they should be preserved, but with some modernisations. Right, so let's look at the first argument then, the argument to preserve these rides. For many people, they are irreplaceable pieces of history, right? It may be the last of its kind, something with significance. For example, the Grand National at Blackpool Pleasure Beach is one of only 2 or 3 remaining Mobius loop coasters. Steeplechase, also at Blackpool Pleasure Beach, is the last of its kind. So there are times when a ride is the last one, right? And I cannot see the argument to preserve it. And there's, I've said already, there's that emotional connection that people will have to some of these attractions. They may be from their own youth or from their parents or grandparents, etc. And the other thing is that quite often this is wooden coasters, right? Given the age that we're talking about here. And wooden coasters, although you still get them, of course, you've still got like GCI, Gravity Group, etc. They're not as common, right? You don't see as many wooden coasters as you do steel. So there is definitely that dying breed argument. A few comments here that I've sort of picked out. We've got one from Mark. I love feeling the history of older rides and experiencing the same thrill that others felt 60, 70 or 80 plus years ago on the exact same ride. These coasters are the foundation of our enthusiasm. Listen, I understand that. That is exactly, the coasters we have now are an evolution of the coasters we had then, right? So it's a fair point that, these are kind of like the grandparents of roller coasters, if you will. These are the early ones. And being able to experience those, especially some of these rides, or rather when these rides were the norm, some of us weren't around, right? So when there's still one left, for example, I kind of would have loved to experience the Virginia Reel at Blackpool. And there was various of these around the world. It's basically this sort of spinning side friction thing. There's only one kind of ride left at Joyland in Great Yarmouth, and it's a small version of it. And I got on that this year, but there's some of these rides that you just think, oh, I wonder what that would have been like. Obviously not going to be thrilling by modern standards, but there's still something about those kind of old rides, so I kind of understand that one. I got a comment here from Harry. Absolutely, it should be a landmark. How often do you hear of a roller coaster make it to 100 years? I think it's incredible. And I think that's also a valid point, right? Of the tens of thousands of coasters that are out there, there's probably only a couple of hundred, if that are around about this age. So it's definitely quite rare to find, and I can see the argument for preserving them. And I got a comment here from Nick. Yes, they should be preserved. They are significant structures that need protecting. Blackpool should be celebrated for saving them. So there's an interesting point here. We'll kind of get onto that later on, but the listing isn't something that the park chooses to do. It's imposed upon them. So, I get that's, they should be celebrated for saving these. They didn't have a choice. That's part of the frustration with this whole process. Right, so if you take a look at the opposite side of the spectrum then, the group of people who think, no, these absolutely should not be preserved, they're holding the parks back, they need to go. Some of the arguments that you hear often is around about roughness and poor guest experience. I think that is the thing, right, that some of us enthusiasts, we kind of appreciate these older rides for what they are and understand that they are going to be that little bit more rough, a little bit more raucous, and that is what many people enjoy. I think to the general public though, they are spoiled now with modern coasters that are super smooth. So sometimes they come off these and just think, that was far too painful, why on earth does it still exist? You need to get rid of it. And the next thing is obviously repairing these and replacing the parts on these becomes harder and harder, right? It's not like you can contact the manufacturer and say, excuse me, can I have 5 new sets of wheels, please, or some new brake fins or whatever it is. That manufacturer no longer exists. So, you're then either having to stretch out parts and kind of keep reworking them, or trying to re-engineer these parts, etc. So there's definitely some challenges around that part. There's also things around about the old systems not meeting modern safety standards. We'll touch on that quite a bit throughout this video, because I think that is obviously a huge part of this, that standards evolve over time, and these are from a previous time period. Sometimes these older rides can lead to downtime, and that is definitely frustrating. Obviously any ride can have downtime, but part of the problem here comes back to that availability of parts. Right, if you've got a modern coaster and a park that plans ahead, they will typically have multiple spare parts kicking around in the kind of workshop, so that if something goes down, it's a short turnaround to get it fixed, get it back out there again. You can't exactly have tons of spare parts kicking around for these coasters because they're old, right? As I said already, you're not exactly just going to ring up the manufacturer and go, give me some more. And then again, the argument of limited space in some of these parks, that they don't have the best throughput. By modern standards, you typically get 1,000+ through a decent ride nowadays in an hour. You definitely don't get that on these older attractions. And then obviously, the younger generation isn't going to be impressed by technology from 100 years ago. I got one comment here from Lee, which is, I've only ever rode this is again the Big Dipper, I've only ever rode it once and it will be the last. It's a good layout, but it's so rough. Again, as I said, for a lot of people, unless you're an enthusiast who appreciates the ride for what it is, that roughness is going to be off-putting and you're just going to go, that was terrible, never doing it again. Right, got another one here from Debbie, and she said, we went a couple of weeks ago to the park and it's the first time I've ever come off the Grand National saying never again. As I said, for some of these older rides, they are uncomfortable or, more painful than their modern counterparts. Comment here from Andrew, theme parks need to evolve to survive. Land is valuable, sentiment won't pay the bills. I mean, he's not wrong, it definitely won't. And land is definitely valuable. Specifically in this park, of course, Blackpool is, for those that don't know, a very, very small park indeed. They're masters of kind of making their rides interweave with each other, but they still have the same problem where they have to remove attractions to put new things in. So I can see that argument as well. I got another one here from James. It wouldn't be so bad if it was a huge park with acres of space, but Blackpool is very limited on space. So again, the same problem. Space is tight and sometimes these older attractions just kind of take up a lot of that space. So that brings you on to the third group then, which is the smallest group of the three, but it's kind of halfway house, right? It is that let's appreciate these older attractions but bring them up to modern standards so that, a lot of the paint problems we've just discussed kind of go away. So allow them to be retracked, allow you to get in, like the Gravity group, for example, to kind of modernise these coasters. Allow new trains on them, because quite often, I've said many times in videos, I think the problem with the Grand National is its trains. And that is a new set of trains, but, well, not now, they're 10+ years old, maybe even 20 years old, but, they are a new style of ride trains, and I don't think they fit that ride very well. Similarly, people talking about putting modern braking systems on, which we'll cover in a little bit, because we think that might be part of the reason that the Big Dipper, that this this post was about, is currently run on one train. And then obviously you can still keep that look and spirit, but just upgrade the mechanics, you know. So it's a bit like, there's quite a big thing right now in kind of re-theming old attractions, right? Kind of giving them a new lease of life. Right? Again, I'm going to keep using this park because it is the case study for this video. Blackpool took Valhalla, gave it a massive refurbishment. They took Launchpad, gave it a massive refurbishment. They're currently doing the same thing to River Caves. And Alton Towers did a huge refurbishment on Nemesis. To the general public, these things just look like a lick of paint. Oh, you've just given that a fresh coat of paint, that's nice. But in actual fact, they're doing a lot of work to it. So, you know, you can certainly make it look the same, but completely upgrade the guts. And then people, if that's the vibe you're going for, where you want it to continue to look like the original, well, that can be done. I got a comment here from Joe. If they can be allowed to upgrade the trains to meet modern safety restraints, they should be allowed to upgrade other features. It's not replacing the ride, changing the layer, or otherwise making it unidentifiable as the ride it is. And again, that's the thing. I think this is where, I think there's a comment coming up about how this has to, with listing, it has to be like for like, which is a frustration. But you know, you could still give the essence of these rides with a modern feel. Got a comment here from Benjamin. Let's take a look at Wildcat at Lake Compounds. It's a historic woody that's been modernised with new trains, a gravity group retrack, and it's now working wonders and keeping the ride relevant. Big Dipper could get this treatment and be good for another century. I think that's also a valid point, right? This is where the listing becomes a problem, because I think they are too restricted in what they're allowed to do. I don't know the exact ins and outs of this, but I'm pretty sure that things have to be like for like and be preserved. So, you know, they aren't allowed to do these big modernizations. And I think that arguably is holding them back, right? They can't get rid of it. They can't modernize it. They have to preserve it, which can be frustrating. Comment here from Steve. I'm on the allow listing, but with the ability to make changes to keep them modern, safety requirements, and make funding more easily accessible, which I think is the other thing, right? So my understanding of the way that listing works is that it's enforced upon the parks. They are basically told that is now a listed structure, you have to preserve it. I don't think they get much, if any, help from a funding point of view to do so. They may get some, but they certainly don't get enough to kind of keep on top of these things. So I kind of alluded to earlier the Big Dipper that we're talking about here. So this season it's been running on a single train. Towards the end of last season it was the same thing. Now, the park has not told us why, so everything I'm about to say is pure speculation. There's a lot of people saying the same sort of thing though, so where there's smoke, there's fire. It's a manual braking system, which basically means that there's a guy in the operation booth with the kind of levers and he has to slow the train down, right? Obviously, nowadays modern coasters are electronic, computerized, and there's sensors in the track. Train's got to here, put the brakes on. Train hasn't got to here, stop all the trains, all that kind of good stuff. But this is an old school kind of guy with a lever, having to stop it. There's some thoughts that with modern health and safety standards, that is not allowed on a multiple train operation. You can take a look at Nickelodeon Streak in this park as well. They were the same thing. They used to operate 2 trains a long time ago. It doesn't anymore, and probably never will, because it's believed that they would need to put modern braking systems in to do so. So I don't know if that's also true on the Big Dipper, that it's either put an electronic braking system in or leave it on one train. The problem with this, I kind of talked about it at the start of this video, is that these attractions don't have the highest throughput anyway. They're from an older generation when, you know, ride throughput wasn't as big of an issue. So when you then start crippling it by taking some of the trains away and make it even more restrictive, you end up with massive queues and frustrated users. So yeah, that's not ideal. Right, the next set of comments are kind of around about legislation and the funding side of things. So I've got one from Doug. I'm not against the idea of rides being listed, but there needs to be a change to the regulations so that historical rides are exempt from modern safety standards. This is part of the problem, right? If they're not, they either need to be allowed to modernise them with some help to bring them up to kind of modern standards, or they need to be kind of exempt, right? A couple of examples. I always find it strange, again, if you know the Pleasure Beach, they have the flying machines, one of the longest continuously operating rides in Europe. And it has no restraints in it whatsoever. You sit in these kind of vehicles, these kind of flying ships that go around, and you've got no seatbelt or anything. Now, thankfully, nobody has been daft enough to stand up and jump out at them. But do you know what I mean? Like, by now, modern standards, you would think you would need at least a seatbelt in this. You don't. So then there's this other thing. So here in the UK, just in case you're international, we every year have to put our cars through an MOT, right? MOT's Ministry of Transport. But basically there's a set of tests that have to be performed on every vehicle to allow it to stay on the road. In the same way that rides and attractions have to get signed off to allow people to be on them. Here's the thing though, the way that that works in the UK, if a vehicle's over a certain age, I can't remember how old it is, 30, 40 years, something like that, it becomes kind of exempt, it becomes vintage, and then it doesn't have to go through that inspection. Mainly because I think the expectation is it's no longer a daily driver, and it's more you're going to be your Sunday car. But it's an interesting concept that potentially these attractions, once they hit a certain age, kind of fall into different like legacy standards, probably standards that were applicable at the time the ride was built, and maybe not necessarily now. So you never know, that's an interesting concept. Right, the next comment I've got here is from Michael, and actually I kind of alluded to this one earlier. So Michael, reading his full comment, he's basically restored a house that was listed. So he knows firsthand what the pain is like. And he says, believe me in saying that it's painstakingly slow and restrictive, but the results are well worth it in the end. That is why it must be so difficult and frustrating for Blackpool Pleasure Beach, as literally every screw and fixing has to be replaced with like for like, in keeping with the aesthetic and function of the build. So that's the thing, right? Currently, at least, whilst it is listed, it has to be preserved in its current state. And that will undoubtedly put some restrictions on what they can do. You know, they can't just suddenly give it a complete repaint to a different colour. They can't change the braking system, all these kind of things that they are restricted in doing. Now, as I said earlier, certainly in the case of Blackpool, they've said themselves that it's nostalgia and heritage that has got the park to where it is. They are 130 years old next year, but they also recognise that that isn't going to continue taking them into the future. Again, as I said, whilst there are some of us of the older generation who appreciate these attractions, the younger generation have no interest in them whatsoever. They just want the new shiny thing. They've seen the big fast coasters and they're like, what is this thing? So, you know, it'll be interesting to see how parks adapt. The other thing is, it kind of, my personal opinion on this one is, I can kind of see it for very, very rare attractions, right? So you could argue that something like the steeplechase at Blackpool, it's the last aerodynamics single rail coaster, arguably that could be marked as listed. It isn't, as far as I'm aware. So, you know, or the Grand National because of its Mobius loop, because there's hardly any of those. So you could kind of see it, but I think the problem as well is that some parks like Blackpool have got multiple listed attractions. So it's one thing when you've got this kind of one ride of significance in the park and you're kind of preserving it. I kind of get that. But when you've got 3, 4, 5, you're kind of holding the park back, because that's a significant portion of their attractions that they are then restricted in what they can do. This problem is never going to go away. It is, as long as things are listed, there's always going to be people who are in favour of that, people who are against it, and obviously the people who sit somewhere in the middle. So you didn't get involved in that Facebook post. I'd love to know your thoughts down below, which side you kind of fall onto, and what you would like to see with these attractions. So as always, I've been Chris, you've been watching Coaster Dad, and I'll see you in the next one. Adios.